get started. We're at 12:02, and I want to thank Maya and our Associate Dean for Research, Justin Levitt, and others at Loyola Law School for putting together this series, webinars on legal areas and the effect of COVID-19. I'm a professor at Loyola where I teach immigration and human trafficking and torts, and I'm also the inaugural Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion, and I'm very pleased to moderate this event with two incredible guest speakers, both alums of the law school. And I'm going to do brief introductions of both of them right now, and then I'll ask each to speak for about 15 minutes on their work related to COVID-19 and specifically immigration. And then we'll open it up to a moderated discussion. I'll keep track of the chat box for those of you who raise questions as we speak and as they speak, and I'll take note of those questions that I can ask them. Victor Nieblas is a Loyola alum, long-time immigration attorney, advocate, expert. He was an AILA president, which of course is the largest immigration bar network in the nation. And he's also been a longtime adjunct professor at Loyola Law School, where he teaches immigration law to our upper division students every single year. And we also have Alejandro Barajas, who's a Loyola alum, was a postgraduate public interest fellow for Loyola, and is a staff attorney with our Loyola Immigrant Justice Clinic, carries a high volume caseload, as well as teaches and supervises students in it representing indigent immigrants on the east side of Los Angeles, and also has a class wherein he takes students to the border to do immigration work at the border. Both will talk about the intersection of immigration and COVID, realizing that COVID is, sort of been a pretext for a barrage of many more sort of draconian, harsh immigration restrictions and measures, but this was all preceded by a parade of those kinds of measures. So be aware that there's a lot that we could talk about, but we're going to try in our limited time to focus on the intersection of COVID and immigration. And we are going to start with Victor, and I'll keep mindful of the clock, 15 minutes for speakers, and I'll give you just hand signal 5 minutes and 1 minute. Okay? Thank you so much for speaking today, Victor.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I hope we had more time. There's so much to talk about, especially in the area of immigration, but I think we're going to have to narrow it down to what's related with COVID-19. So with those parameters, why don't we get started? As we all know, COVID-19 has brought big changes around the world, and especially to our immigration system. And we've seen those actions by the administration. As Kathleen indicated, some of the changes are valid concerns with COVID-19. Others are probably pretext to do what the administration has been planning to do for a long time. We'll try to keep away from the political aspect of some of these changes, but inevitably we cannot ignore them. So let's start with the non-immigrants. So what's going on with COVID-19 and non-immigrants abroad? So these are people outside of the United States who want to come to the United States, but now are confronted with the COVID-19 restrictions. As we all know, the administration, at the very least, has instituted 4 separate travel restrictions to restrict individuals that come to the United States. And very quickly, because I think it's important, when we talk about the restrictions, when we talk about these proclamations, first thing that we have to ask ourselves as attorneys, as law professors, is where's the authority coming from? How is he doing this, or how is the administration doing this? And what we've seen is that there's a section of law in the Immigration Act, Section 212F, that really hasn't been used in the past, but it was this nugget in the Immigration Act that this administration started using, and they used it with the initial travel ban that sought to exclude Muslims from entering the United States. That issue went to the Supreme Court in the Trump v. Hawaii case, the Supreme Court basically said under Section 212F, the administration does have, or the president does have these powers to restrict individuals who come into the United States. And the actual language is by proclamation, suspend the entry of all individuals or aliens or impose restrictions where he may deem appropriate if it would be detrimental to the interest of the United States. So under that language, the Supreme Court said, yes, you do have that authority, at least for the travel ban against Muslims. And the administration has really jumped on this, and they have used this section for everything that's been going on related to COVID. And the question to ask, and it's just a question, is this a blank check, right? Can the administration do anything with Section 212F? And that's something that's going to be questioned for many years to come, and probably challenged, and probably go back to the Supreme Court at some point. But certainly, is the Section 212F, is it unlimited? Can anyone restrict the president if they fit under the definition of detrimental to the interests of the United States? So that'll be interesting. So the travel ban countries, I'm sure we've heard them: China, Iran. There are 26 European states when COVID-19 was a big issue, still is in Europe, Poland, Spain, France, a bunch of other countries. In fact, it's interesting that now the European Union is considering banning people from the United States because of our COVID-19 problem. There were some restrictions and some exceptions, to these restrictions. So legal permanent residents, citizens, spouses of U.S. citizens or residents, children. There are many exceptions to this, but for the most part, these countries were left out. Interesting that also the United States entered into an agreement with Mexico and Canada to restrict travel from each of these countries because of COVID-19, and really only allowed essential travel. So they suspended non-essential travel into the United States from Mexico and Canada and so forth. That includes, tourist visas, recreation. So those types of individuals will not be able to enter into the United States. Again, there's some restrictions. Usually U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents are not subject to these exceptions, but certainly it has an impact. There was also closure at the embassies and consulates. On March 20th, the Department of State suspended all routine visa services at all embassies and consulates worldwide. And so that left many people who were there to obtain their green card interview and hopefully be able to secure the green card, trapped. I had one of those clients who was there, and it was interesting because she had a very difficult time deciding whether or not to go because of the pandemic. At the last moment, she did go to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and once she got there, the announcement came down, consulate were closed, and she was stuck there. And so it was a very stressful time for her. Fortunately, we were able to request a parole from the port of entry. She had a child who had respiratory problems, so under the pandemic, the child would be under one of the essential categories or vulnerable categories. Luckily, we were able to allow her in. Many other people were not allowed in and are still stuck outside of the country because of the closure of the embassies. Just so you can see the impact, in April of 2020, the consulates and embassies only issued about 50,000 visas. As compared to January of this year, in January of this year, they issued 713,000 visas. So you can see the shrinkage of these visas that were given out, and certainly the amount is staggering. The administration also announced a proclamation to suspend immigration, and so this was one of the big ones. The president said we're going to suspend immigration period for 60 days. Within 30 days, we're going to determine whether or not we continue with the suspension. And so this really has had an impact. So it impacts, for example, family petitions, people who are petitioning their family to come in. For example, U.S. citizens petitioning their parents, that's been suspended. Children over the age of 21 of U.S. citizens, that's been suspended. And by the way, all of these are family categories. So if anybody knows about immigration, we're talking about the first and third preference categories under immigration that were suspended. Legal permanent residents who were petitioning their spouses or their children, also suspended. U.S. citizens petitioning their brothers or sisters, also suspended. Diversity visa lottery winners, also suspended. And so what we saw is that this big chunk of family-based and employment-based visas were basically suspended. And this would cut immigration into the United States by 33%. And we're talking about almost 360,000 visas, immigrant visas, people who are seeking green cards from coming into the United States. And this is where the COVID pretext comes into play, because the exact categories that were suspended were the exact categories that were proposed under the RAISE Act by the administration. They pushed the RAISE Act in 2017. The RAISE Act did not garner enough support in Congress. And so it was the exact same categories being suspended. So people were saying, where have I seen this before? Is this really, does it really have to do with COVID-19, or are we talking about just the agenda of the administration? So I'll leave that out there for consideration. On Monday, we saw another proclamation by the administration. And now the administration started focusing on non-immigrant workers, professionals, H1B professionals, all the high-tech professional immigrants trying to come in to work, L1s who are the, for example, intercompany transferees. Say, for example, Google has a subsidiary company in a certain country, and they want to bring in their manager or their executive to the United States to learn or to help out. That's been now suspended. There are very specific rules that need to be followed. This just came out on Monday, but we are talking about probably affecting 500,000 of these non-immigrant visa holders that might not be able to come back into the United States. Again, there are some exceptions. And those exceptions are very few. But if you have a visa already, a valid visa, then you don't have to worry about that. So we got to move a little faster here. So immigrant processing in the United States. So what's going on in the United States? Well, first of all, CIS suspended all in-person interviews on April 24th of 2020. Little by little now they're opening up. Naturalization ceremonies are happening again. In fact, I just noticed and read that there are people swearing in by car, just drive through, and they're, swearing in. So it's picking up again. But again, these offices are barely opening. One of the big things with CIS is that it's lost money, according to them. They need money to be able to function. They've asked Congress for $1.2 billion to be able to function because of COVID-19. It's interesting that it's the same agency that wants to exclude individuals because of public charge, yet now they're becoming a public charge by asking Congress for money. Wow. Also, immigration courts. How is it impacting the immigration courts? Well, the immigration courts were slow to act. The immigration union started getting involved, saying, look, you got to suspend these cases. There's all these people involved. There could be 100 people in a room at a time. Finally, EOIR, which controls the immigration courts, decided to suspend non-detained cases. Little by little now, they're planning to reopen them. The target date is July 6th. However, there's a big controversy as to whether or not they should be doing that. Senators have sent them letters saying, look, you need to slow down. We need to consider this. Show me what type of preventive and safety measures you've taken. We'll see how that goes. But some courts are opening, some still are not. The good developments is that they allowed us, at least attorneys, to file electronic filings, which was great. We hadn't done that before, so we could file all our documents by email. Wow, so that was great. And finally, the impact on enforcement and detention. Well, ICE decided to say, look, we're going to temporarily adjust our enforcement posture. They haven't really been as active. However, they still have been arresting people. The big problem is the people in detention. COVID-19 has spread like wildfire in the detention centers here locally in Los Angeles County, also in San Diego and across the country. In fact, right now, I just saw a number. There's over 2,500 people in detention who have now been infected by COVID-19, and there's been lawsuits, habeas, across the country trying to release some of these individuals. Some of them have been successful. However, they have to meet a very specific class, over 65, part of a vulnerable group, because they have a medical condition. I had one of those clients, and ultimately they were released after 6 months. We were requesting them to be released the past 2 months, and within that period of time, the client also was infected with COVID-19. So it's a big problem. COVID-19 has had a big impact on the immigration processes. There's a lot more we could discuss, but I think I'll end my comments at this point.
Thanks so much, Victor. I know that was a lot in a short amount of time. We do have a couple of questions. I'd like to, Alejandro, do you mind if, both of you can answer these, and then we'll move on to Alejandro's presentation?
That's great. Yeah.
Thank you. So the first question is from Elizabeth, a recent acquaintance, former persecuted Guatemalan refugee, resides in San Diego County and wishes to have his wife with him in the United States. This is more, I guess, a practical thing. Where can he get good help, pro bono help? I think that the suspension description that Victor gave probably is applicable to the viability of getting his wife over now. But maybe Elizabeth can reach out to the Loyola Immigrant Justice Clinic. We have a general email box that can send referrals. And then from an attendee just now, Victor, you stated that the proclamation suspended immigration for the preference categories for those abroad. Does this apply to immediate relatives from abroad too? This person can't seem to find information on that.
Yeah, so the brief answer is that spouses of U.S. citizens and minor children of U.S. citizens are exempted, so they can come in. They're considered immediate relatives. But for example, parents of U.S. citizens are also considered immediate relatives, but the parents are subject to the suspension. So that's a quick answer to that question.
Okay, great. Another question that I'm just going to address briefly, and then we're going to move on to Alejandro. Could you briefly explain again what the COVID-related orders were and why critics see COVID pretext? The critics, and Victor raised this earlier, draw COVID pretext because of the very broad proclamations that the executive branch has made to pretty much end any kind of in-migration across all categories that seem to be unrelated to high infection rates of COVID. And Victor also explained that some of these proclamations mapped on exactly to what the White House proposal for immigration restrictions going forward for Congress to legislate and pass would be. And those categories of immigration that the executive branch wished to extinguish entirely mapped on to these proclamations that have been made under the COVID pandemic name. Okay, now let's move on.
If I could just quickly add, I think part of the justification is also the economy. So they're saying by blocking these temporary workers, it will allow more Americans to be able to get jobs because we have a high unemployment currently because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So jobs, protection of American jobs is also part of the equation in these proclamations.
Okay, thank you for that, Victor. So we're going to move on to Alejandro and then return to the questions. Thanks to the audience for the questions. Alejandro.
Thank you to Victor for that, great explanation of things that have been happening. There's so much to talk about, though. So I want to just, add to what Victor had said. As far as, there are those exceptions to the most recent order that he issued on Monday, that it is immediate relatives as far as spouses and children, does not apply to parents. However, it's also important to keep in mind that despite the existence of these exceptions, with the consulates continuing to remain closed, right now there's basically a ban to all immigrant visas being issued abroad. And so I believe that's been the case since April when they were closed. He initially issued the green card freeze, that some are calling it, on April 24th, and that applied to family-based immigrant visas, employment-based immigrant visas, and also diversity lottery. And so initially the consulates were closed anyway. So this green card freeze that he issued on April 24th was somewhat symbolic because the consulates were closed anyway. It wasn't like they were issuing visas anyway. But he took that a huge step further on Monday when he increased the ban or expanded it up to at least December 31st. And in addition, like Victor had mentioned, he now included all of these employment-based temporary visas, the H1Bs, H2B, the J, and the L. And so the reason that, like Victor explained, these were things that the administration had openly tried to achieve previously. And so, they hadn't had any success, and that's why we believe that they're using this as an opportunity to finally implement some of these measures that they've been trying to take against immigration since the beginning. And so it's going to have a huge impact, especially for tech companies that had voiced a huge opposition to him instituting this ban, especially to the H1Bs, so for the highly skilled workers, most commonly, engineers, people within the tech industry take advantage of these visas, and they were great. You would be, one of the requirements is a bachelor's degree. You'd have a H1B visa. You'd be allowed to stay here, work here for 3 years. You could extend it for another 3 years. Sorry about that. And so it was a great visa for a number of people. They would issue about 85,000 each year. And so that's going to have a huge impact on companies. And they've been saying that's going to have a huge impact on their ability to rebound. They're saying that, the companies, the people that support the existence of these H1B programs are saying that in actuality, these are jobs that either Americans are not willing to do or are unable to do. And so they expect the void now without the ability to have these workers in place. So we'll see what kind of impact that has. Most of the companies that would use these workers are obviously not happy. On the other side of the debate, people are saying, you know what, they were exploiting this program to find some cheap labor abroad, and so that's kind of what they're attempting to attack through this ban. Another area of law, so as far as the closures with the consulate, I don't know if Victor knows different, but I don't think there's a set date on when they're supposed to reopen. Things continue to remain closed indefinitely, which is, it is a huge problem. There's people waiting for their interviews who were already in line, and right now it's just indefinite. They just have to wait and see. It's also a big issue, I think, for the diversity lottery applicants. Reason being, just a little explanation what the diversity lottery is. It's literally a lottery. You apply and they just pick numbers at random. And it was really, really great because it's mainly for people who don't have another avenue to immigrate to the US. In general, people have a big misconception of why don't they just migrate the legal way? But without an employer, without a family member that can petition for you, your options are extremely limited, and it can be difficult to nearly impossible to try to get to the US. So this diversity lottery was a great way to give the opportunity to people who didn't have a family member, another avenue, a chance at immigrating themselves and their family members to the US. And the way that it works is you apply, people get picked, and then you have to get your green card by October 1st of that year, where you're allowed to apply. So by October 1st, all these diversity lottery applicants that have paid money, already submitted all their documents, we're expecting to get all their families here, they have to get that visa by October 1st. And if they're unable to, then they just lose their opportunity. There's no plan B for them usually, and that's it. They just have to try again, pay more money, and hope that they get lucky again. So with this ban being extended to December, as far as I know, that's going to then, prohibit all these diversity lottery applicants from applying for their green card. Sorry. Oh.
My mistake, 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't know if I had a question or.
I'm a poor timekeeper.
So yeah, that's going to be, I see it extremely problematic for a number of people. And then also another big vulnerable group that's being impacted by the COVID closures is the people hoping to apply for asylum that were placed in the Migration Protection Protocols program, the Remain in Mexico. So as part of that program, the U.S. entered into an agreement with Mexico where people coming to apply for asylum that are placed in removal proceedings are allowed to return them to Mexico throughout the pendency of their entire removal proceedings. And that was already a huge issue. It limits your access to resources, to counsel. So it creates all these obstacles where there was already all these obstacles in place for asylees. So it just added so many more. And unfortunately, with all these closures, they also closed the immigration courts and also any hearings dealing with the MPP, the Remain in Mexico. So since I want to say early April, that's remained closed, the program. They haven't issued any, they haven't had a scheduled or had any hearings. They continue to postpone them. They're supposed to reopen immigration courts, I believe, on July 10th, and they're supposed to restart the MPP program July 17th, but they've continued throughout these last few months, they've continued to extend that deadline and extend it. And it's really difficult for these people who are waiting in Mexico for their opportunity to apply. They usually show up to the border with little to nothing, no resources. The resources in Mexico are extremely limited. They're, of course, also struggling with the COVID pandemic. So it puts them, they were already an extremely vulnerable group, and it makes them even more vulnerable now where they're just stuck there waiting for their chance to apply. And we don't really know when they're going to get that opportunity. So that's another huge issue. Of course, one of the areas of immigration court that they refuse to close are one of the other extremely vulnerable groups, which is the detained immigrant population. And so for some reason, they've continued to allow that. Initially, in order for you to be able to go to court to represent your client, you had to bring your own personal protective equipment. These were the N95 masks, everything that was basically impossible to get at some point. They were requiring that you were personally responsible for obtaining that protective equipment for you to be able to see your client and represent your client in court. With the detained immigrants, it's already difficult. It's usually a lot speedier. It's difficult to, drive out all the way to Adelanto to meet with them. It's limited, very limited to what you can do with them, and also how you can prepare for the case. So it's already a difficult situation for both the attorney and the client. But with COVID and needing this equipment, they made it even more difficult. One thing that they've tried to do to continue the hearings has been allowed for telephonic appearances. And so that's been something that I've done. And it's something that I don't prefer. In my experience, I feel like you can't advocate for your client as well as if you're there in person. Additionally, they've been allowing the judges to appear by video or telephone as well. And I feel like that also puts the client at a disadvantage because it allows the judge less of an opportunity to almost humanize the client. If there's a client in front of you and they're pleading for their own case, it can only benefit them. And so stripping them of that ability to be personally present in front of a judge, and also the attorney does have the option to go in person, but with all the virus and the issues related to that, a lot of attorneys have elected to do the telephonic appearance, especially if they can't get their hands on this protective equipment. So that's been problematic, that those have continued, the ones where it's likely the most difficult to prepare and get ready and represent. And then also they've taken advantage of the virus by completely stopping these asylum applicants from proceeding with their case. while the pandemic continues. And the closure, like I said, does have the end date of July 17th for the MPP program, but that could very likely continue to get extended, especially as we continue to see the surges to dramatically increase in the last week or so. So those are some of the big ways that it's impacted immigration law. And so we'll see exactly what happens after December 31st. I personally think the COVID pandemic might be extended, might last longer than any of us would like. And so this is going to continue to give the administration a very good excuse for extending these programs or even continuing to expand them. Like Victor said, we'll try and keep it away from getting political, but it also just highlights the importance of November. I think whatever the results are in November is really going to dictate whether this grows and expands, or whether they continue to start taking some of these measures away that they've implemented recently.
Thank you both. We have several questions in the queue, and I'll identify those that haven't been answered. One question, however, is important that maybe hasn't been addressed directly was about detained children. There has been a class action lawsuit on behalf of detained children, simply because the interests are more compelling when it comes to detained children. And I personally don't actually have an update on the status of that. I know that there are individuals that have been released from detention, and also Victor mentioned those that were, immunocompromised or over 65. And that's my question for either of you. If you if you have any information regarding detained children.
Victor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that even children, unaccompanied children, they're still applying this policy to them where they're refusing to place them into removal and allow them to be placed in the Office of Refugee Resettlement and place them like they would previously. I believe that they're using COVID as a huge stop, a huge barrier, and basically returning them and asking them to come back at a future date when these current policies aren't in place.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening, and that's been a goal of the administration. One is to push back on asylum claims, and two, make sure that they can remove unaccompanied minors to their native country as soon as possible, or at the very least, make them wait in Mexico long enough so they can give up. Yes, that is happening. Initially, these courts, just like detained courts, the courts for unaccompanied minors were ongoing, but they have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's a big mess. It always has been a big mess. So,
and then it's important to highlight that they don't have an age exception. I recently did a consultation for a client. He was 15. He was with his 2-year-old brother, and they were both immediately sent back. So I don't think they're making an exception for anybody within a certain age group, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thanks for your responses. Okay, so now there are several questions from our attendees. First question, originally directed at Victor, Professor Nieblas, but I think either of you could answer. Because of the uncertain nature of COVID-19 and the reopening of consulates, are you recommending that clients wait on submitting I-601A waivers?
I would say no, and so here's the reason. If you start the case from beginning to end right now, we're looking at about a 3-year wait. Or 3.5-year wait before they actually get their interview in Ciudad Juarez. Obviously, if you are ready to get your interview in Ciudad Juarez, at that point, you might want to, delay it because of the suspension. But if you're just starting or you're in the process of filing the waiver, I would say go ahead, simply because the waiver in and of itself is going to take about 10 to 11 to 12 months for an answer. And unfortunately, that's been something that this administration has, I don't want to say developed, but it's been the reality that all types of petitions, whether it be family petitions, whether it be waivers, the wait time has increased and doubled in some times. So, for example, a family petition I-130, before it would take 4 to 6 months to get approved. Now we're looking at a year. The waiver used to take about 5 months for an answer. Now, 10 to 12 months. When the National Visa Center has all the documents and they're ready to send it to the consulate abroad, before it would take 3 months. Now, a year. So everything is taking longer periods of time. So I would say go ahead and file it. Go ahead and go through that long wait process, because it's going to be a while before you actually get that interview in Ciudad Juarez.
So there are a few more really good questions. Are there opportunities for bond to release detainees from the detention centers to avoid being infected?
Well, you can request bond. You can raise that as a reason, but it really is not going to have a big impact. I had, like in my case, my individual my client was an arriving alien. So that's a legal categorization, which basically means judges don't have the right to entertain bonds from arriving individuals. So you have to request a parole from DHS. That's a whole different process. They have to answer your phone calls. They have to take your requests. That in and of itself is very difficult. But if you have a hearing before a judge, the judge is going to look at flight risk, whether or not you're a danger to society or property or yourself. And so at this point, unless you're part of some of these lawsuits, class action lawsuits, the fact that COVID-19 is a factor, from my point of view, it's not a big factor. They're not really considering it unless you're part of this vulnerable group. The judges usually say, why don't you work it out with counsel, with government counsel, and see if you can come to an agreement. So that's been my experience. I have been able to get people out on bond. I can tell you that COVID-19 is not, it's not an important factor for the process. It should be, but it really isn't. They look at the traditional points to consider bond.
Anything to add, Alejandro? There are quite a few questions, if you would.
No, that was exactly right. I know a lot of organizations, private attorneys are trying to rely on the parole because it's their only option, and trying to use the current pandemic and their risk of being detained of contracting that, using that to support their request. But from what I've heard, it hasn't had a major impact.
Right. An announcement from one of the attendees that it's important to mention that Ciudad Juarez can schedule an emergency interview for those stuck in Mexico waiting for their final interview through their U.S. citizen spouse. So I guess that goes to family immigration, and one mechanism for immediate family members to enter the country if they're married to a U.S. citizen.
That's true. That is true. And also for H2A visas, the agricultural workers, they're also accepting appointments for them as well. So it's not completely closed, but for the most part it is.
Yes. Yeah, right. Which is consistent with what both of you are saying, that it's not completely closed to LPRs, U.S. citizens, that kind of thing, or relations to, or family relations to U.S. citizens and work visas. What if, this is another question. Okay. Does anyone have experience with a client during COVID-19 who has left the United States and tried to re-enter under an F1 visa? So presumably is student.
Yeah. I don't do F1s. I don't do students. I haven't had that situation. But if the person leaves the United States, again, there's some travel restrictions, and depending what country they're from, all of those are going to be considerations. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, same as Victor. I haven't had a personal experience with that, but there are some restrictions that could apply to them re-entering.
Right. And those restrictions being largely the almost 30 countries or 30 plus countries that were declared at the initial stages of the pandemic. Okay, and then another question. What effect will the H1B visa ban or any of the other visa bans have on international students coming for secondary schools or college graduate degrees?
That is a great question. I think it'll have an impact because they won't know before a student knew that there was at least the possibility of, after their studies, to try and get petitioned by an employer for an H-1B, or there were at least these avenues that they could try and take advantage of. But with those being limited and their post-degree career in question, I think it might make some students second guess as to whether this is the ideal place for them to receive an education.
Yeah, and keep in mind, Canada's saying, come to us, come to us.
Yeah.
Those states that don't want you, come on.
Right.
They're publicizing it all over the place. So it's, we're educating individuals, and we're not allowing them to use their talents here in the United States, and they're going to go elsewhere.
Right. That's a good point. Okay, this is another good question. I know that there are several questions remaining. This might be the final question, however. And for those attendees who did not have their questions answered, there are a couple of you. I want to invite you to email me because I see your questions. I can answer them. And you know where to find me. My faculty webpage is at the law school website. Okay, so this question for both of you, I would like both of you to respond to this from an attendee. How do you recommend that we balance health and safety with immigration considerations? What policy changes should we look to implement and look for?
Oh, a great question. I mean, the politicians haven't reached a conclusion on that. From what I see, I think practical considerations are, court cases. I don't think they're ready. I don't think the courts are ready to be reopened. If anybody has represented anybody in immigration court in those initial master calendar hearings, you could have 100 people in a room. I just don't see how they could spread people 6 feet apart in those small courtrooms. And immigration with CIS, they have taken measures. In fact, the local field director here in Los Angeles sent out pictures of how their waiting rooms will be. And we are talking about a room that used to be full of seats, now have maybe 15. And so if precautions are taken, I think we can function. However, ultimately, it's going to depend on the state. How is the state doing when it comes to COVID? Right now, California is not doing so great, right? I think we've broken records these past 3 days, over 5,000 infections in the state. Other states are suffering the same thing, Texas and other states. So, I think they have to work in conjunction with each other. We have to be able to measure what's going on in the state and the danger that it's posing individuals who are detained. We had that question before. I really do think that COVID-19 should be an important factor for the judges to consider, for the Department of Homeland Security to consider in releasing the individual. Why? Because you're going to have people dying in these detention centers, and people have already died. So you need to take preventive measures. I'll just add this real quick, something that no one has mentioned. What about the health and safe being of the individual, of the attorney, of the judge, of the trial attorney? What about our mental health as well? Because we are suffering as well, and that is something nobody's mentioning, but it's something that we need to consider and open our eyes to.
Thank you, Victor. Alejandro?
I think Victor had great suggestions, just practical, implementing practical precautions. And one of those things that I really liked that he said was just each state deciding when it's safe for them to reopen. And I think immigration courts are somewhat taking it state by state. I believe Hawaii was planning on reopening. I think they reopened. And the rest of the majority of the courts have remained closed. But I think that would be a practical approach, would be to really pay attention to those specific states and the measures that they themselves are implementing when deciding which courts are able to reopen.
Thank you. And just chiming in, I agree with both of you, and particularly when you think about the immigrant detention population and that they are largely non-criminal actors. Not largely the population is intended for because of preventative detention, and to ensure that they show up to their hearings, they're not a flight risk, rather than public safety risk, and that makes the restraint on them in immigration detention even sort of more unjustified, particularly in light of how infectious COVID is. So we're at the end of our session, and I really appreciate Victor and Alejandro lending us your wisdom, knowledge, and insight. And thank you to all of the attendees and really terrific questions. Again, I know a few questions weren't answered, and please feel free to forward them to me. I think I can answer them. If I can't, then I'll ask Victor and Alejandro to help out. And thank you for joining. I do want to mention one last thing. The Loyola Immigrant Justice Clinic is having a series of lunchtime brown bag Zoom sessions like this over the course of July, and that will be addressing removal defense specifically, and keep an eye out for that. And with that, I say farewell. And I say farewell to Alejandro and Victor, and I hope to see you soon in person.
See you in class, everyone.
There you go. Yeah. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
Bye, Alejandro. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.